The Old West was a land where violence and bloodshed were the norm. From lawless frontier cities to the open ranges, survival was a battle for land, power, and dominance. This era is marked by some of the most brutal wars, battles, and massacres in American history. Gunfights were a daily occurrence, and clashes between settlers and Native Americans painted the landscape with tragedy. Today, we take a look at 10 of the most devastating conflicts in the Old West. These are the dark chapters of America's history, where only the brave, strong, and ruthless survived. Let's dive into the chaos and bloodshed that shaped the frontier. At the top of our list is the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn, which took place on June 25, 1876, along the Little Bighorn River in what is now Montana. A coalition of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors faced off against U.S. Army forces under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Kuster. Tensions had been simmering ever since gold was discovered on Native American land, and the U.S. government sought to force the tribes onto reservations. Many resisted, and Custer's 7th Cavalry was dispatched to confront them. Ignoring warnings about the sheer size of the Native American force, Custer led his men into a death trap. Custer's troops arrived in the valley around midday, unaware that nearly 3,000 Native American warriors under leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were ready for battle. As the news spread, Sitting Bull led efforts to protect the women and children, while Crazy Horse led the warriors to confront Custer head-on. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, Custer's regiment of about 200 men was annihilated in less than an hour. This decisive Native American victory became known as Custer's Last Stand, and it marked the most catastrophic defeat for the U.S. Army during the Indian Wars. However, the victory was short-lived. Over the next few years, the U.S. government doubled down on efforts to subdue the Native American tribes, eventually forcing nearly all of the Sioux and Cheyenne onto reservations. Another haunting chapter in the West's violent history is the Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led Colorado soldiers in a surprise attack on a peaceful village of southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, in Sand Creek, Colorado. The Native Americans, under Chief Black Kettle, believed they were under the protection of the U.S. government. They were wrong. The soldiers attacked at dawn, killing over 148 Native Americans, many of them women and children. Chivington's men mutilated the bodies and set fire to the village, an atrocity that shocked even other military officials. While the initial report celebrated Chivington's actions, public outrage eventually led to his disgrace, and he left the military. However, the damage was done, and the massacre left deep scars that would haunt relations between settlers and Native Americans for years. Next, we have the Wounded Knee Massacre, one of the final tragic confrontations between the U.S. military and Native Americans. On December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army attempted to disarm a group of Lakota Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. The Lakota, led by Chief Bigfoot, were mostly sick and starving, their traditional way of life devastated by decades of war and forced relocation. Tensions were high due to the spread of the ghost dance, a spiritual movement that frightened white settlers and military officials who saw it as a sign of rebellion. As the soldiers began to disarm the Lakota, a shot rang out. Whether intentional or accidental, it remains unclear, and chaos erupted. The soldiers opened fire, killing around 250 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children. Many of the U.S. soldiers who died that day were killed by their comrades' own gunfire. The massacre marked the tragic end of the Indian Wars. One of the more overlooked but equally important battles was Beecher Island. On September 17, 1868, Major George Forsyth and a small band of 50 frontiersmen were attacked by a force of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors along the Aracari River in Colorado. The soldiers managed to retreat to a small sandbar, where they held off the attackers for 9 days. The Native Americans, led by the fearsome Roman Nose, launched repeated assaults but were ultimately repelled by the soldiers' superior firepower. Despite heavy losses, Forsyth's men held out until reinforcements arrived. Roman Nose was killed in the battle, dealing a significant blow to the Native American forces. Forsyth's desperate defense is remembered as one of the most heroic stands of the frontier wars. The Hayfield Fight of August 1, 1867, was another key battle in the Red Cloud's War. It took place near Fort C.F., Smith in Montana Territory, where a small group of soldiers and civilian haycutters were attacked by a large group of Native American warriors, primarily Arapaho and Cheyenne. The defenders, numbering only 30, took cover behind a makeshift fortification of wagons and fought off wave after wave of attackers. Armed with Springfield Model 1866 rifles, the soldiers managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Native Americans, who eventually withdrew after 6 hours of intense fighting. Although the defenders suffered minimal losses, the battle underscored the ongoing conflict over the Bozeman Trail and the Powder River country. In the Tonto Basin campaign, General George Crook led U.S. forces in a series of brutal engagements against the Yavapai and Apache tribes in Arizona Territory. One of the bloodiest confrontations was the Battle of Salt River Canyon in December 1872. Crook's men, alongside Apache scouts, launched a surprise attack on a Yavapai camp, killing 76 Native Americans, including women and children. The campaign was part of Crook's larger strategy to force the tribes onto reservations, a goal he pursued with relentless determination. Despite the bloodshed, Crook earned a reputation for his fair treatment of Native Americans, often advocating for their rights even as he fought against them. Another notable conflict was the Battle of Turret Peak on March 27, 1873. After a series of raids by Apache warriors, Crook's forces tracked the raiders to their stronghold at Turret Peak in central Arizona. Under the cover of darkness, Crook's men and their Apache scouts scaled the rugged terrain, surprising the warriors in their sleep. The ensuing battle was a slaughter, with over 50 Apache men, women, and children killed. The victory at Turret Peak was one of the final blows in Crook's campaign, which eventually led to the pacification of the region and the forced relocation of the Apache to reservations. The Red Cloud's War, which raged between 1866 and 1868, was one of the few conflicts where Native American forces won a decisive victory against the U.S. Army. The war was sparked by the construction of forts along the Bozeman Trail, which passed through the hunting grounds of the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Red Cloud, a prominent Lakota leader, led a series of successful attacks against U.S. forces, culminating in the Fetterman Massacre on December 21, 1866. In this battle, a force of 81 U.S. soldiers was lured into an ambush by Native American warriors and killed to the last man. The defeat shocked the nation and led to the eventual abandonment of the forts along the trail. Finally, the Battle of Washita River on November 27, 1868, was another grim chapter in the Indian Wars. Led by General Kuster, U.S. forces attacked a Cheyenne village under Chief Black Kettle in present-day Oklahoma. The attack was part of a broader campaign to subdue the Plains tribes and force them onto reservations. Custer's men charged into the village at dawn, killing over 100 Native Americans, including many women and children. Black Kettle, who had long advocated for peace, was among the dead. The battle was hailed as a victory by the U.S. Army, but it remains a symbol of the violent and often indiscriminate nature of the Indian Wars. These are just a few of the countless battles and massacres that defined the Old West. It was a time of fierce struggle, where lives were lost, and entire cultures were nearly erased. But it was also a time of resilience and survival, where the spirit of the Native American people endured, despite unimaginable odds. The legacy of these battles continues to shape the history of the American frontier, reminding us of the high cost of conquest and the enduring fight for justice and recognition. Randall knew that silence was crucial. To prevent noise and stones from giving away their position, he ordered his men to crawl on their hands and knees. Under the cloak of night, they crept toward their target, a rancheria perched near the peak of Turret Peak Mountain. With the men lying in wait, the assault didn't come until daylight, catching the inhabitants completely off guard. Panic ensued. Many of the indigenous people, in their terror and confusion, leapt off the mountainside, plummeting to their deaths below. Some attempted to fight back, but it was a brief resistance, and soon they either perished or surrendered. In total, 57 Native Americans lost their lives, with many more injured or taken prisoner. The battlefield was a grim scene of carnage, worsened by the tragic discovery of innocent civilians who had died as a result of rolling stones and encircling fires. When the dust settled, the Battle of Turret Peak had dealt a devastating blow to the Yavapai and Apache tribes. Less than 2 weeks after the clash, on April 6, many of the hostiles surrendered to General Crook at Camp Verde, a sign of the heavy toll the battle had taken. Several of Crook's men received the Medal of Honor for their roles in the fight. Yet, this wasn't the only brutal engagement during the period. On November 25, 1864, far from Turret Peak, another deadly confrontation unfolded at Adobe Walls, the remnants of an old trading post along the Canadian River. This was the first of two major battles at Adobe Walls, where Comanches and Kiowas clashed with white settlers. The Plains Indians, fiercely protective of their land, saw the incoming wagon trains as a threat to their territory and way of life. General James H. Carleton, the commander of military forces in New Mexico, wanted to stop the raids on the Santa Fe wagon trains. He ordered Colonel Christopher Carson, famed as Kit Carson, to lead an expedition against the Comanche and Kiowa winter encampments. Carson, with 14 officers, 321 enlisted men, and 75 Ute and Jicarilla Apache scouts, set out from Fort Bascom in November, armed with mountain howitzers, 27 wagons, and enough supplies for 45 days. They headed toward Adobe Walls, a place Carson knew well, having been there over 2 decades earlier during his days as a mountain man. After a brief delay due to a snowstorm, Carson's men camped near Mule Springs, roughly 30 miles from their destination. Reports soon came in from scouts that a large group of Native Americans had gathered at Adobe Walls, leading Carson to order an immediate advance. They traveled through the night, enduring bitter cold, and forced to remain silent. By dawn, they had reached their objective. The assault was brutal and swift. Carson's men demolished 176 huts, destroyed supplies, and even took the scalp of a Comanche warrior. However, the odds were overwhelming. Faced with a massive force of Native American warriors, Carson made the difficult decision to retreat. Although he hadn't dealt the decisive blow he had hoped for, his retreat was praised as a tactical success, given the circumstances. Carson would later remark that reoccupying Adobe Walls would require at least 1,000 soldiers. Years later, in 1874, the Second Battle of Adobe Walls would unfold. This time, 700 Plains Indians, led by the Comanche chief Quanah Parker, attacked a group of buffalo hunters stationed at the fort. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the 29 hunters, including the legendary sharpshooter Billy Dixon, defended their position for 5 days. Dixon's remarkable shot, killing a Cheyenne warrior from nearly a mile away, became the stuff of legend. This battle set the stage for the Red River War, a campaign that would ultimately force the Plains tribes onto reservations. While these battles raged in the southern plains, farther north, the Cheyenne faced their own tragedy in what would become known as the Battle of Washita River. On November 27, 1868, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Kuster led a dawn raid on a peaceful Cheyenne village led by Chief Black Kettle. The village, located near the Washita River in what is now Oklahoma, had raised a white flag to signify peace. But Kuster, eager to rebuild his reputation after a court-martial for desertion, paid no heed to the signs of peace. His men attacked with ferocity, killing over 100 Cheyenne, including Black Kettle himself. Women and children were not spared in the onslaught. Though the battle was hailed as a victory, it left a dark stain on Custer's legacy. Custer's aggressive tactics would ultimately lead to his downfall at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where he and his men were annihilated by a coalition of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. But before that infamous defeat, he led several brutal campaigns, including the Battle of the Washita, which would be remembered as one of the first major victories for the U.S. during the Indian Wars. Not all battles resulted in overwhelming victories for one side or the other. The Battle of Red Buttes, also known as the Battle of Custer's Wagon Train, unfolded in July 1865, as a U.S. Army supply train made its way toward Platte Bridge Station. Sergeant Amos J. Kuster led 25 Kansas cavalrymen to protect the 5 supply wagons, but they soon encountered a force of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Despite warnings from other soldiers about the dangers ahead, Kuster refused to turn back, declaring, "We're heading to Platte Bridge." It would be a fatal mistake. Kuster and his men were ambushed and surrounded. They fought bravely for hours, but one by one, They fell to the overwhelming numbers of native warriors. Only 3 scouts survived to tell the tale. The West's bloody history wasn't confined to large-scale battles. Small skirmishes and ambushes, such as those at Beecher Island and Turret Peak, where Randall and his men cornered the Yavapai and Apache, also played a crucial role in the U.S. government's efforts to subdue the native tribes. The victories were often celebrated, but they came at a steep cost. Entire cultures were uprooted, and the Native American way of life was systematically dismantled. In the end, these battles are a reminder of the high cost of conquest. The American frontier was forged in blood, and while the stories of heroism and bravery on both sides endure, they are forever stained by the violence and tragedy that marked this era. As we revisit these events, we must remember the resilience of those who fought, the suffering of those who were displaced, and the legacy they left behind.